The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to the March 2019 Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum, Education Research Journal Club podcast. The Pre-Hospital Care Research Forum is dedicated to the promotion, education, and dissemination of pre-hospital research. We believe that it is the responsibility of emergency medical professionals worldwide to build a body of evidence to examine pre-hospital emergency care. The PCRF partners with the National Association of EMS Educators to promote research literacy and advance the science of EMS educational research. Here with the PCRF Journal Club, we take a closer look at some of the latest research in medical education. I'm Megan Corey, and I'm here with Dr. Bill Toon, and soon joining us will be David Page. The study we're going to be reviewing today is entitled Retrieval Practice and Bloom's Taxonomy. Do students need knowledge before higher order learning? This is published by Pooja Agarwal, who is a cognitive psychologist, and this is in the Journal of Educational Psychology in 2018. So Dr. Agarwal is unable to join us this morning, but if you can learn more about her work and her passion for bridging the gaps between education and the science of learning by visiting her webpage. You can also check out, and we can have that in the notes at the end. And you can also check out more on retrieval practice by visiting www.retrievalpractice.org. We want to send out a special thanks to Mike Bowen for selecting this article. Mike will be listening in and joining us in our chat area. And this review is paired, as usual, with an article in EMS World called Research Alert, a review of original medical education research. So we encourage listeners to check that out at emsworld.com under the category of education and training. So thank you all for joining us today. We'll begin, and we want to remind you that you can use the chat feature on your screen to type in questions and comments, and we will bring those into the conversation as we go. So I want to just start with a little background, and Bill Toon is here too. We were almost having a little mini podcast before we even started this, just talking about this, and we figured we better save our conversation for when we come on. So we know you're going to have some input as well. So just start typing in when you feel it. If you feel like you want to be unmuted, you can send a message to our organizer, and we can unmute you and join in, especially if you have something that's a little longer to read in the chat area. Because I'm going to assume we have a lot of EMS educators out there that are listening in, and we would like to hear your practical experience here. Because as EMS educators, we're dealing with the practical environment, students in an educational setting, whether that setting's a classroom, lab, clinical, or field environment. So we seek best practices that'll benefit all of our students, knowing that they're going to enter with a variety of background knowledge and experience. So to develop these best practices, we're going to turn to the research, but this research comes from a variety of circles: educational psychology, cognitive sciences, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, and then, of course, there's action research, which is teacher researchers. So the practical aspect of educational research. So there's the world of education theory, and any of you out there who have gone through a graduate program in education can attest that theories abound, even without a lot of evidence or with minimal evidence to support them. So one of those areas is the concept that fact-based knowledge is a prerequisite for higher order learning. And what do we mean by higher order learning? Well, reference, and if you can see the slides here, we just put up the traditional Bloom's taxonomy, and then some of the updated, one of the updated versions, which is more of a wheel. The taxonomy of educational objectives. So I think we'd all agree it's based on cognitive outcomes, not really psychomotor and affective. Until recently, we haven't seen that. The pyramid model also suggests that we need the foundation level first in order to build on and attain higher level learning. And I don't know about you, Bill, but I'm on our curriculum committee, and there's this constant demand when we have course outlines and programs that come through our college curriculum committee, a constant demand for, you have a verb here that's, describe or list, and we really want a higher level verb. We want to hear analyze, evaluate, something that's higher level. Do you have that experience in your past? I know you're retired now, but just kind of the push for higher level critical thinking verbs?
Yes, and this gets back to some of what we were talking about before, is how much do even the people sitting on that committee understand what we're talking about, since it abounds from theory, what these kinds of questions, I don't think it, to me, in a simplistic way, I don't think it draws down to just what is the verb that's used. It's in the context of how it's used that really matters, and stuff towards getting them to think and assimilate this information to come up with an answer. And I'm very hot on this because I just took my National Registry exam yesterday for my third time, and that's the way I choose to recert, is through examination. So, and if you're an instructor, and I would strongly encourage you, you don't have to do it every other year, but if you maintain your National Registry, you probably should be taking the exam so you can stay current and give them that firsthand experience of what the exam is like, because my first exam was paper and pencil many years ago. So
I think that's a great idea. So what you're also mentioning is that, because we now call them student learning outcomes instead of just objectives sometimes. So, when we think of objectives, we think of what we're going to do in a class, what we're going to gain from something that's on maybe you do that in a lesson, but an outcome would be something, what do we expect that the student will be able to do by the end of a course or program. And so the outcome then, it draws us to, well, how are we going to measure this? So we can write student learning outcomes, but they also have to come with a measure. And I think that's the real key, is how are we going to measure this? So most of the recent taxonomies, though, cross content and context and incorporate psychomotor and affective domains. For example, in medical education, we're going to seek to transfer learning, right, from classroom to lab and simulation into a clinical and field setting. And that's that, I think the paper calls it FAR transfer. It's like this big gap that you have to sort of jump over with live patients. We're always trying to kind of bridge that gap. And we're hoping maybe simulation will help do that. But we know that retrieval practice, spaced practice, and interleaving, these are concepts we've talked about on this podcast before. They're all effective strategies for enhancing student fact knowledge and transfer of knowledge, and also long-term learning. So retrieval practice is also demonstrated across a wide variety of student populations and environments. And retrieval practice, we always think of, okay, just testing, but it really is about pulling that information back and applying it. So some evidence that we're engaging in complex retrieval practice, it's more beneficial than starting with fact-based knowledge and definitions. So what this study did was they wanted to examine the intuition that fact knowledge must precede skill or more complex, higher order learning. And so they used complex passages and content that students would read, and then complex quizzes and tests versus fact-based quizzes and tests. So what's the relationship between fact-based learning and higher order learning? So that's essentially what they wanted to ask. So they used 3 frameworks, and then we'll go through the 3 different experiments and talk about each of these as we go. And this was a single author, so she used 3 frameworks. And the frameworks, people might have heard of these frameworks. There's desirable difficulties, transfer appropriate, and foundation of factual knowledge. So desirable difficulties is one. I don't know if people are familiar with the Bob Bjork's work out of UCLA, but this is where challenging mental processes increase retention and application of knowledge. And we're talking about spaced practice, interleaving, and complex retrieval. So if you're challenging your mental processes, it'll increase your retention. We also know, though, that we've talked about cognitive learning or cognitive load theory, and talked about how that might be something that refutes that to an extent. Then there's transfer appropriate, which means encoding during learning matches that of testing. So if you have a fact-based test, and that will enhance fact-based learning, higher order learning to higher order testing. So it's matching your learning to your testing. That's the idea of transfer appropriate. And then the foundation of factual knowledge is what they're actually looking at, which is that fits with the original Bloom, which reinforces that factual knowledge before higher order learning is what will enhance learning. Will enhance higher order learning. You need that foundation is what the theory says. So there's some support in cognitive load theory there that students aren't ready for higher order learning because they won't have enough free memory to handle the difficulty. So these are the three kind of conceptual frameworks they're looking at. So the experiments, and I'm going to forward, I don't know if, are we having problems seeing the slides here, Jennifer? There's a...
yeah, it looks like we are.
Okay, that's a... Okay, we'll try and work on that. I can see them on mine, but I'm not sure if there's, and we have, we just did a poll about how many people are EMS educators. We got 93% educators there, and I'm going to say 7% potential educators out there. Hint, hint. So, and wow, isn't that great to have 7% of the people out there who are not EMS educators coming on to an exclusive educator podcast, which is great. I would argue that you're an educator, but you don't know it yet. Okay, so Bill, anything about these, you know, you went through a graduate program, right? You went through a graduate education program.
Yeah, both my master's and doctorate, but the thing, you know, I like the fact that you pointed out that this is her theories, or as the single author, how she presents them, but she does have very good evidence to support each one of the different principles that are out there. But I want to mention to anyone who actually read this article, it is, we talked about this before, it is a thick article, meaning that you probably had to read it. I was on my third read before the start of the presentation, just to make sure that I was trying to grasp what she was trying to talk about. And our goal here today is to deconstruct it so we can say, okay, how do we apply it to what we're doing in our practice right now? And I want to encourage any of the people in the audience that read this and have their suggestions and practices, how they do it, to make sure they chime in. We'd be more than glad to unmute you. And the other thing is many people, you know, particularly when I found, when I was a newer educator, based how I gained time or experience, it was amazing sometimes that I did stuff in my classroom that turned out to have theory behind it to support it, even though early on I didn't know what that theory was of what I was doing. It just seemed to make logical sense. And some of what she talks about in here seems to make logical sense, even though she goes about it in a very complex way of explaining it.
Yeah, and we were also talking about this before. You know, I'm from a science background, so I'm very used to physiology specifically. So I'm very used to medical literature and science literature, where you have very limited editorial space. You have, you know, very strict limitations on word counts and figures and everything else. And I was pretty shocked when I did my doctorate in education. In the social sciences and in education, how much license you have to be very detailed. And on the one hand, I appreciated it because, you know, I can really specifically almost picture the experiment that's going on without too many questions. But on the other hand, I have to read a 20-page paper, thank you, Mike Bowen, and sift through this. So that's the EMS part, right? Where it's, wow, I got to read this whole paper a couple of times to see if I can get it. So yeah, that was one thing I think I was a little surprised at. Also the theory, like you were mentioning the theory, there's a lot of theory that comes up, you know, in a graduate program, and sometimes scant evidence to support the theory. So not completely accustomed to that. Although, yeah, I would argue we do have that in medicine as well. So going on, and again, I'm not sure if we can see the slides yet. We're working on that here, but if you can't and you have this paper, table 1 is an important one because it actually shows the predictions it shows each of the kind of conditions that they're looking at. In retrieval practice is going to be the predictor, and then the final test is going to be the outcome. And they're looking at the theoretical predictions, and then at the very far right of the table, it shows the actual results from each of the 3 experiments. So you have experiment 1, it's labeled as E1, E2, and E3, and what kinds of results they obtained. So if you have to sift through and select anything, look at the visualizations from each of the experiments, which we'll show in a minute, and then table 1 actually has the theoretical predictions and the results. And so they're looking at essentially when we engage in retrieval practice. So you engage in a learning activity, and in this case, it's going to be reading passages and of some degree of complexity. It looks like different things. And then engaging in the retrieval of that information. How do you retrieve that information? Do you do it through fact-based quizzes, meaning you're just recalling specific details, dates, or things that you can easily lift? Or is it a higher order quiz where you have to either apply or evaluate or analyze something taken from the passage and it's not simple recall? Or is it mixed? Or do you use a mixed quiz where you have both fact and higher order quiz? So that would be your predictor, your intervention. And then the outcome would be the final test. And how does someone do if they do a fact-based test and they've had any one of those interventions, or a higher order test? They didn't do a mixed test. They did a fact or higher order test and all of these. And then there were different, numbers. So what this table 1 lines up the theories. It lines up desirable difficulties, the transfer appropriate processing, and then the foundation of factual knowledge. And then just from looking at it, the table, you would see that anything that starts with a fact quiz and is going to be based on the foundation of factual knowledge, because that's what you're looking at. We're saying that, okay, do fact-based, retrieval practices, improve either fact recall or higher order recall in a final test later. And so that's what, really what they were looking at. But they were looking at the other 2 theories, holding up the other 2 theories as well. Okay, so let's then look at the experiments. So first 2 were done on college students in psychology, different students each time. And the third one was done on middle school students, which I thought was interesting. And Bill and I had an interesting discussion about consent in that one that we should really bring up. But the college students, they essentially had 4 retrieval conditions. So in experiment 1, they studied once, or they studied twice, or they studied once and had a fact quiz, or they studied once and had a higher order quiz. So the study once, study twice is looking at, whether rereading, re-looking at something. So we've talked about this on this podcast before, that restudying is not as powerful as retrieving. So we know that constantly being called on, whether through quizzes or tests or retrieval practice, is better than just telling people to reread and restudy. And then in the appendix also of this table has got some sample questions, so you can look at what they mean by, fact-based versus higher order. So those were the 4 conditions: study once, study twice, study once plus fact quiz, study once plus higher order quiz. And then the outcome was after 2 days, the students completed a fact quiz and a higher order quiz. I don't know what order.
Megan, yeah. I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but nobody can see your slides, and I think it's hard for everybody to know what you're talking about. I
okay.
want to break.
Do you want? Should I change presenter here?
Yeah, I think so. I don't.
Wow, there's lots of people listed when I change presenter.
Yeah, lots of people are having a hard time, and it's just, I think at this point, if we can fix the visual, or maybe if you want someone else to do the presenter mode if it's a problem. It looks like it might be multiple screens.
Okay. And if I say stop showing screen, what happens? Sorry, guys.
Do you want to email the slides over to Haley or me, and we'll take over presenter mode? That might be.
Yeah, I did. I did actually earlier. If you wanted to take over presenter mode,
awesome.
I can do it.
Sorry, everybody, but we want to make sure we don't move.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it's important. I think it's really important. So.
And I know you've presented them before, so I'm wondering if it's a different problem.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I've got a different computer, so who knows?
That might be it.
Could be that.
I'm opening them right now.
Okay.
So I will request presentation right now.
You can flash that Bloom's.
Okay.
So should I see something?
I think everybody should see my computer now.
Oh yeah, I can see it.
You can probably
I'm
see
pretty sure I
everything.
can because it looks the same as in the past.
Okay.
So flash by the second slide, which is the pyramid and the wheel, just so people know what we were talking about. I'm pretty sure all you 93% educators out there, pretty much. And then the next one is the table one. If you can go to the third slide, that's table one. Okay. And then we're going to go to experiment one, but just stay on this one for just a second so people can take a look or even screenshot if you're doing something like that. So the first experiment we were talking about was the college students and again, psychology students. They had to read 8 passages. They had the 4 conditions, and then they had the fact quiz and higher order quiz condition at the end. They call it a 4x2 within subject design. So 4 conditions, 2 outcome measures, and then 8 passages from 8 books. Psychology students, they consented, and 48 psychology students to be specific. And what they found, and now you can go to the next slide, what they found was that retrieval practice with higher order questions greatly improved delayed higher order test performance by 23 to 28%. Compared with studying once or twice. Okay, no surprise there, really, because we've seen a number of studies now that have shown that studying versus retrieval practice definitely goes ahead of it. But retrieval practice here with fact questions improved fact performance by 24%, but it did not enhance higher order performance. So, and you can see that in the visualization. I like when people put tables and visualizations, so you can kind of glance over that. So, Bill, this was the first one, the first study. So any thoughts on this? I don't think there was too many surprises on this. Delayed test performance?
No, and the author mentioned that even herself in her discussion section, that none of this was surprising. This fits with what's been reviewed in the past and discussed in the past.
Yeah, it's kind of a zero out, right? It's able to, it's kind of your control experiment in some sense, that says, okay, that not a whole lot of surprise here. Although I think, and we'll talk about this maybe a little bit after just glossing over the couple of other studies. I think it's a leap maybe to say that that this supports that fact knowledge is not necessary for higher order knowledge. It says that fact-based testing, doesn't, or retrieval practice doesn't improve higher order test performance 2 days later. That's what it says. So, I've been making big leaps about things, I think is kind of dangerous here.
So, but something I do want to say that makes sense to me. If you only prepare your students with fact-based questions, the lowest level questions that you create, they will not pass the National Registry exam with just knowledge.
Absolutely.
They have no way
to develop higher order thought.
Yes, that's right.
So
and
that's what Dave. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Yes, and I do think that the leap you can make, which is not necessarily that the questions themselves are creating a higher order, but the leap that I think this author is trying to say is that the giving of the higher order question drives fact gathering and not vice versa. Fact gathering does not drive higher order thinking, but higher order testing will drive fact gathering and higher order thought. So you're getting a double bang for your buck when you ask a question that's a critical thinking question.
Yeah, I think that's what, and they do say that in the end. She talks about, and I actually have it underlined about, that this is like National Registry when she says the study, multiple choice alternatives were developed to require students to make fine-grained distinctions between similar concepts. So test development is another subject that's going to come out of this. I want to review the 2 other experiments really quick, and then I think this is a really important topic to get into, and that's the item analysis, and related to what Bill was saying earlier was, are we actually, preparing our educators for something like this, or are people still, using what's existing in resources from the publisher, and how are those resources changing? So the experiment 2 was the same. It was 48 college students, but not the same ones. So different college students, but in the same school. And it was designed to study mixed complexity. So that goes back to that wheel model of Bloom. So if we can go to the next slide, that's experiment 2. Again, another 4x2 within subject design for retrieval practice conditions, which means a higher order quiz times 1, a higher order quizzes times 2. So you're taking 2 higher order quizzes, mixed quizzes times 2, fact quizzes times 2. So those were your retrieval practice conditions. Then the outcome again was delayed testing of 2 test types, fact versus higher order, after a 2-day delay. So you're preparing them with either higher order quizzes or single quiz, mixed quizzes, or fact quizzes, and then testing them on fact and higher order. So the results there showed that retrieval practice with 2 higher order quizzes improved delayed higher order test performance with an additional 8% compared with 1 higher order quiz. And so more is better. And then retrieval practice is most powerful when when questions encountered during the initial quizzes are similar to the questions on the final test, which kind of goes toward that transfer appropriate processing framework. So that was the second study, a little bit different, but looking at the power of higher order retrieval practice as compared to their higher order testing. And you can see it again in the visualization of the bar graph there. Then the final one, I thought this was very interesting, was, okay, but do younger students receive the same benefit from mixed quizzing as do college students? So there has, she mentions at the beginning that we've seen retrieval practice benefits across age groups, across student types, in a variety of different areas. So it made sense that you would bring it into the to the middle school age group. 6th grade students, history class, 142 of them, initially ended up being an N of 88 because of absences for at least 1 quiz. 34 students were absent for at least 1 quiz. It was a 3x2 design, so 3 retrieval practice conditions: higher order quizzes, mixed quizzes, no quiz, and then 2 outcomes: delayed, delayed test types, higher order, and fact tests. Same 2 outcomes. So this was younger students. And just a quick aside here, Bill and I were talking about consenting younger students, and they've talked about assent, which is, I guess, parental, approval. So I'm just curious if you've had any experience with that, Dave, with any of the, younger students or populations within education, where you've had to do, actually, even let's say that there might be a 17-year-old in your class. If you're in an EMT or EMR, you might be dealing with high school students. So
fascinating question, right? Because if we do have post-secondary education options, BSEO students, generally their parents consent for their students or their child to be participating in a class, but they haven't necessarily consented to research. So you would have to get consent from the parent if you were going to conduct this kind of research.
Yeah, we did have a quick question from David Gould. What is the difference between fact-based and higher order quiz, or rather, what is higher order practice? And the author actually goes into that a little bit with reference to Bloom's taxonomy, with the kind of higher order critical thinking. So are we asking someone, and actually in this paper, if you, at the end in the appendix, they give you examples where a test question is designed, and then there are, recall questions that are within the different items, and then there are recall selections. And then they have a higher order question where you actually can't select it. You can't pull some detail from the passage simply. You have to actually apply it or analyze it. And I would say, you know, if you've ever done a test item analysis, or if you've ever gone, I know I've done some of the Fisdap ones where you go on to and participate in a test item analysis. Those are extremely helpful if you ever participate in any of the workshops, or if there's any in your area, or if somebody offers them through, you know, your, you know, one of the vendors. I know Fisdap has the item analysis section. Those are very helpful to help you distinguish between, is something a knowledge level, application level, or problem solving level question items. So any comment on that, Dave? Because I know we talk about this a lot.
This is a passion of mine, and I'll declare conflict because I helped start the whole process over at Fisdap, and though I'm not an employee, I obviously continue to support it. But I think if you're talking about the difference between asking a recall question and higher order, whether it's application or problem solving, the easiest way to get to the top levels of Bloom's taxonomy is really with judgment. And so you're asking for people to compare in multiple choice questions for possible answers. That comparison of distractors that are similar but not the best. So this is where 4 correct answers and one with a unanimous vote from the experts saying that is the best. The concept of the comparison is what gets you to critical thinking. You can also achieve that fairly quickly if you mix 2 different pathophysiologies. If the trauma patient is an elderly patient who fell because of and also has a dysrhythmia, then you know it's the chicken and the egg concept. Both things are occurring. There's a cardiac problem and a trauma problem. I often use the diabetic that crashed their car and is having some dizziness. So what happened? Did blood sugar get low, or did they crash their car and then they had symptoms of dizziness because they've got a traumatic problem? And so you have to really consider the patient. And I think if EMS providers or EMS educators were to focus on the real patients that we have on the street and stop trying to clean them up for educational purposes, but really think, what would you do first? What should you do first? Most importantly, best. Then they'll get to those critical thinking items very, very quickly. But it's a really great question, because most of us didn't get taught how to do this. So I don't know how EMS people think that we're supposed to learn this. You know, you injure your back, so you start teaching. That's how we're supposed to learn how to construct proper, you know, assessments. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I really want to encourage people to look at the appendix in here, because it's a really good example of what is a knowledge-based question versus an application or problem-solving question. And also, when you look at these, this is the other thing. That I think is really a misconception. And Bill and I were talking about this before we came on, that a test question is always has 2 right answers and 2 that are not right answers, and that is not the case. All 4 should be plausible. So a really good higher order test question, and actually even a fact-based test question, should really have 4 plausible distractors, or 4 plausible answers, and then 1 is the best answer. So it really shouldn't be that you create a test and, well, 2 should be plausible, 1 should be the best, and then the other 2 should be like completely out in left field. Otherwise, you might as well just create a 2 distractor question. That's it, because it doesn't make sense. That's the other thing. And when you look at these questions, you might think, hey, these are actually pretty difficult because they're extremely similar in their responses. And I think that's the other thing about building tests is you're trying to generate higher order learning, even in, I would argue, even in what we consider, quote, fact-based. I mean, do we ask about blood flow through the heart by just looking at a 2-dimensional heart, or do we ask about it by creating a stream of where the blood is flowing? The following is the correct path of blood through the heart, and you're following a flow of multiple structures. That's very different than saying, the heart valve on the left side of the heart is, that kind of thing. I think that you can have the various levels of what I would still consider fact-based questions. Anyway, that's kind of a tangent. So in this third experiment then with the younger students, this was 142 or 88 sixth grade students, again, 3x2 design. What they found was that mixed retrieval practice, and you can advance the slide to the third experiment, mixed retrieval practice produced the greatest level of performance on both fact and higher order final tests, which was interesting. Retrieval practice increased learning for middle school students compared with no quizzes. Again, no surprise, but it was really important that they put that. I think it was important they put that group in there so we could see, once again, the benefit of retrieval practice. And the benefits of higher order learning was limited to higher order quizzing and mixed quizzing. Again, benefited both fact and higher order learning. So the author conclusion is that building a factual base via retrieval practice did not enhance students' higher order learning. And, keep in mind that this is via retrieval practice. This is not, well, people don't need certain, is this about prerequisite courses? And that's a larger discussion, a larger kind of policy-related discussion. Is there evidence for prerequisites or acceleration versus remedial or developmental coursework? That's a whole other ball of wax, but it's still related. One of the things I wanted to bring up is in some of the previous research, the subjects, commonly, if you ask college students how they best study or what are the best ways to study and prepare for learning, what things will enhance your learning, they'll select things that are not demonstrated in evidence. In fact, they'll rereading, restudying is commonly a method, and we know that retrieval practice is better. So I think it would have been interesting for them to have asked the students ahead of time, which of these groups do they think would be better, or which things would be better, just to get a sense of how in touch they were or not with their own performance. So Dave and Bill, where do you think this takes us? I mean, how does this apply to, first of all, you think there are any limitations to this that were glaring? And do you think this is something, specifically, do you see any action research out of this in our EMS programs?
Absolutely. I think that we have a ton of educators on the line today, and I think this is the power of being able to have us just in our normal daily work do research that will help us advance our profession. And I do think we have been stuck in this remember, recognize, recall. If you look at all the objectives from the DOT, and it's an invitation to now have this particular paper to say, we need to rethink the way that we're doing this. Now, the Committee on Accreditation already pushes us towards that, and the National Registry is obviously testing at these higher levels. So I do think it's an absolute mandate, a critical action for us to be thinking about our assessments, because we don't want to graduate people who kill people, and we don't really want to be having exams that don't tell us anything other than, do you remember factoids? I do think, this is an invitation. I don't know that it's perfect science, but what science is perfect, right? Every project is going to have strengths and weaknesses, and there's limitations to all of this. I think that they're proposing a nice model. And if we can randomize a group of students to receive these types of questions first in a very simple, straightforward way, and then the next group to be mixed, I think that that's a strong methodology.
Yeah. Why do you think that the mixed quizzes were more potent for higher order learning? In two of the experiments, it was that actually in both that used mixed quizzes. I thought that was interesting.
I actually am not surprised at that at all. I think it fits perfectly with the concept that you need to reward our students for having read the material. In other words, they whether they learned it in lecture or in a video or by asking their phone a friend partner or medical director, they have to feel like they're making forward progress. If they're lost because the facts that they did accumulate weren't ever rewarded, then I don't think you're giving the carrot that they need. You're just telling them you can't use that stuff. That's not useful. So I do think mixed methods are stronger, so that they do feel like they're making forward progress. But I also think towards graduation, you're going to focus on higher order and drop a lot more of the lower level items. So early on, probably focus on items that are encouraging that, it's always stimulus and response, right? You're always going to create if repeat patterns in training anything from our students and from your puppy. If you want to reward the student for having done the right thing, give them a good grade, show them that knowledge is now useful to them, and you'll potentiate their interest and ability in continuing that success.
Yeah, they point to something in here too about recent research indicating that students are going to adjust their learning strategies based on their expectancy for the types of tests. So I think that's probably important too, that maybe they'll have more well-rounded kind of learning strategies too if we're having a mixed method of testing. And then another question I have, and anybody out there, just type in if you have some response to this. How can we apply something like this to other things besides written tests, like simulation, like when you're teaching a student one-on-one in the field? They're still retrieving, you're still calling on their knowledge, and how do you be more deliberate about your practice with teaching a student in different settings, and not just a written test? This would be something interesting, I think, to study.
I think it'd be fascinating, and frankly, we spend a lot of time talking about outcome-based care, evidence-based care. This is outcome-based education.
Absolutely.
I'm tired of measuring how many hours people sat in a chair in a course, and how many people spent online, log in and walk away from the computer every 20 minutes. So in the end, what we really care about is patient care and whether the student can actually perform it. And when we do assessment-based education, then it's really a competency-based model, not a put in your time and then you'll get a trophy. And I think when we do bad assessments or assessments that are so low level, we're teaching people that that's what learning is all about. And frankly, that's why we are educators, is to help them sort out the higher order thinking process, so that when they're faced with a difficult situation, they can really actually do something about it. I love the way Pooja here says, they get into an entire section on cognitive load theory.
Yes.
Suggesting that fact quizzes should facilitate higher order learning by reducing the demands required during the final test. But that doesn't necessarily translate, and unfortunately, she's they say here mental effort ratings did not shed light on this puzzle. So when your question is about how to do this in simulation and in real life on ambulance or hospital clinicals, this is where I often see preceptors trying to have memory games. What's the dose of this, and not encourage students to look things up, but rather to memorize things. And in fact, the power of the preceptor, the power of the educator, is really about how to think about the problem. What will you consider first? What should you do best next? And that's the way that teachable moments, those windows in time when you can use a case to really put the student, not in this time a multiple choice question, but in a real case where no one's going to get hurt if you wait another 30 seconds to a minute, and ask the student, do you think that what are the next steps here? Do you want to start an IV? Do you want to reach for the oxygen? What's the next step? And I believe, and there's been a bunch of different projects with the data from Fisdap that say the more they're out on the street, the more they're out on ambulances, the better their higher order results and the better results on the registry. So one-to-one correlation, the more you ride along, the better you do. I think that's one of the reasons why hospital clinicals have shown bad results. If you look at the David Newton study with that group, because in the hospital, people are not being asked to think. They're asked to just go in, start IVs, push meds, see things, observe things.
Well, wait here. Wait here.
Oh, I figured I'd piss off somebody.
This is more of a personal beef I have, and we've had this discussion before, is many EMS education programs don't have the FTEs that they need to really enhance things. And I say this, for example, and this is, I had a paid nurse / paramedic, first a nurse, then I trained as a paramedic, do the clinical education in the hospital. So students had someone there that actually made them have to think and pointed them to patients and roadmapped them through the hospital. So I was able to, I didn't need to increase the hours that they spent in the hospital. I was able to increase the quality of what they spent in the hospital. And it makes a huge difference. And then when the nurse didn't have particular specialties, I would hire nurses in OB to come in and paid them over. I paid them out of my budget overtime to be with my students one-on-one. And when
but you're just rolling in the money.
No, but the point is that you don't see this kind, when you look at other healthcare education, you don't see people just let go without there being, even look at how physicians, even an intern and a resident, they're not there in those clinical sites alone. They have someone that is there to help direct, ask questions, and really develop this. So don't get me,
there I can 100% agree with you that our initial FTO process should be a residency and it should count towards a bachelor degree. There you go.
And I wanted to say to you, I agree also, though, that the ride time is important. And I was so impressed when I went, this is back in 2010, I went to the Harborview paramedic program, and I was there for the resuscitation academy, but I arrived early to do some ride-alongs. And I was really impressed that the students, two things they do. One is they ride students in pairs on their ambulance, and they make them work as partners. And then the paramedics are there to supervise them, not just one paramedic, both the other paramedics supervise
Delaware
them.
does that too. Fantastic.
And then the other thing that they did, though, is the classroom was right across the way from the two busiest medic units, and students did call from the classroom, and a call trumped it sitting in the class.
Love it.
So they would get up, they had a portable with them, they'd hear the call, they'd get up and they would leave. And then they were always matched in teams of 4, 2 at a time. The other 2 students stayed back, were required to collect notes, handouts, and cover the material with their classmates for what they missed when they came back later. So they taught they built in real team work right from the beginning. And when I sat in the back going to a call with these guys, the two students, they were already making a plan. Okay, I'm going to be lead. I want you to grab this set of equipment when we go in the room. I want you to do this. That's what you want.
Absolutely.
It was wonderful. It was wonderful.
Yeah.
And I could see why their learning was so greatly intense. And then talking to the preceptors later, they could talk about how the student was doing or not doing and stuff. But we really need to rethink our entire process, because our profession is changing. And if we really want to be prepared to do more of what we could be doing, then we need to look at the way that we're doing the education we're doing now.
And I think that you're absolutely right. And when you look at some of the requirements that, or the, not maybe requirements, but suggestions and standards that have come out from the Committee on Accreditation about internships, people mistakenly think that field work needs to be done all at the end. In fact, field clinical or field experiences can occur all throughout the process. It's just that there should be one moment where you just say, okay, we're done. You need to really actually be in charge, and now we're really measuring your team leadership skills once you have all the didactic. But field experiences could occur all along. You know, a lot of people think, and thank you, Mike Bowen, for sending me this, but the concept of the taxonomy, Bloom's taxonomy, is simply outdated. It's really about cognitive ability, and so you have a range of cognitive ability, and as you improve in your reasoning, you're incorporating new information. So your Harborview example is just beautiful, because people go out, they see the need, they have the immediate, oh my goodness, they're assessing themselves in their own ability to care for a patient because they're panicking. They're going, oh my goodness, do I know what to do? Of course, they have people there to take care of the patient if they don't know what to do. And they can certainly do the BLS portion because they've already mastered that, one hopes. But the concept that you're standing in front of the patient thinking, okay, what am I going to do next, forces a motivational event that says, I didn't study this well enough. I'm not exactly sure. And that mixes the final answer, that the end result that you want, which is graduating and taking care of patients, with the what most students consider horrific, me included, to go sit in a classroom for hours on end, and puts it into action, right? So I think that all it mixes cognitive ability, and frankly, I think simulation can help us do it in a much more controlled way. You know, Harborview has a luxurious ability to be able to step out and step into a medic unit. Most of us don't have that luxury, but we do have the luxury to create simulated experiences that are going to motivate in that same manner. And I think we're capable of it if we just consider those events as assessments and measure them, and then follow up with whether or not the student is really improving that cognitive ability.
Again, I would argue that simulation should begin sooner rather than later. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't begin it on day one. It's your expectation of the student that changes, not their need to participate in simulation. Your expectations of what they can perform when they walk in with a CPR card are different than, you know, in an EMT program than what they are, you know, midway through the semester.
Absolutely.
So.
And I'm going to draw the same analogy in psychomotor skills that we just did, just because people are up in arms about this Appendix G thing. You know, it becomes an obsession and an anxiety producing event. And in fact, if you think of these multiple choice questions in this research project, the same way for skills, we are obsessed with a single skill. Just memorize the skill, memorize the steps, demonstrate the steps. That is base knowledge. It's bottom feeding, scum sucking, low level. You just regurgitate the crap and then you move on. What we need is people putting it into context. And people misinterpreted Appendix G as saying you have to do all of these skills first, then you're going to go to scenarios.
Yes.
your point about let's mix it up, let's learn these skills, now put them to work in a scenario. Now here's some more skills, put them to work in a scenario, is absolutely at the core of what Appendix G was intended to do. Now perhaps it didn't get explained correctly on a spreadsheet.
And the flow chart, yeah, exactly. The spreadsheet, that one flow chart, I think has everybody. And I just want to mention really quick that Jim Dench is talking about this on. He had sent us something about, you know, this isolated scale mini scenario, complex scenario, real patients, and reaching higher level function in that way. And that kind of relates to Chris O'Connor also asked us about problem-based learning. And I think all this is problem-based learning. It's case-based, it's application level. So, and Mark Malonzo is also saying, you said it, Dave, power of the educator, teachable moments, problem, case-based stuff, not just tell me the dose or policy. So I just wanted to make sure we're listening to you out there and loving these comments.
I think we can achieve much more efficient use of time, but also cognitive ability. And we can do so in actually a very pleasurable way for the student who really is focused on the work. They're not focused on the certification as much as they're focused on succeeding in saving lives. The certification is a necessary requirement for them to be able to achieve that. And so when they show up to work, not to school, and their assessments, and again, going back to the research we're looking at today, their assessments mirror real life. The items on the test are about real patients. That's when you see the spark of their excitement. When they begin to argue, well, what's going to be on the test? What is the exam going to tell us? What they're really saying is this is a barrier to my understanding what I need to know to take care of the patient. And I think if we can focus back on that cognitive ability to care for patients, those registry questions become a speed bump. They're calibrated to minimal competency, and most of our students don't just want to be minimally capable. Neither do most educators want their graduates to be minimally capable. We want them to be able to compare two situations and be able to really do well and hopefully have really good outcomes, not just average outcomes. We were just in a research workshop and heard the appalling 51% success rate on first attempt at intubation. And this is a classic example of, sure, you can intubate a piece of plastic on a table, but put the plastic on the floor, put some crap in the plastic you have to suction out and cover up their lungs so you can't even tell if you're ventilating properly. And now you've got a contextual, more difficult, cognitively challenging event. And this is what these multiple choice questions are helping us do. It's reach in and try to stir up some judgment and comparison.
Hallelujah. This has just been
I don't care
fantastic.
about the subject at all, actually, being, and it's just really not a passion of mine. And I promise you,
none of us out there, right? And you know, I'm gonna kind of hit up Bill Toon because I know he's probably still thinking what he says almost every single education research podcast we have is, how are we preparing these educators? And Mark Malonzo actually had said this too. You know, it depends on the quality of the preceptor interaction too, not just the hours of the clinical and field. And I think, you know, we can say this every time, but we're the ones, if anybody's going to make this change, it's all of us on this right now. So step one, come to the podcast, you know, join into the conversation, send your educators here, go to NEMC. I mean, those are the big things. Let's form an action research network. Let's do this. Let's not just continue to say well, you know, our educators are people with back pain. No, let's not accept that anymore. And we can only do it together. I don't want to be the only one at my college saying this.
That's the thing, right? We are a family, and
yes.
If we don't help each other, it's like we're hurting each other. I think these silos of educators who think, oh, I'm just going to do this by myself. It's just never have I understood why it was that everybody wanted to reinvent that wheel. And again, I've already declared conflict, but it's really, there's no cost in participating in the Fisdap webinars where we create questions and review them.
Yeah.
And that's a pay it forward. You put in one, you're going to get 1,000 back. So truly, if, you know, as Bill said, we have very few resources, very little time. You participate once a month or once every 6 months, and everybody else is just chipping in too, and we're all together going to be able to create those critical thinking questions, which takes a village. It's not as easy as one thinks to just come up with it on our own. And when we have that peer review process, when we have that family that's measuring that with research, then we have evidence-based practices.
Yes. Bill Toon, any final thoughts here? We're at the top of the hour from Bill Toon's EMS Educator Preparation course.
No, but we've already, you handled that very well, and you're very right. I kudos to the NEMSI 1 and 2 program to get people started, but no one that graduates from that is truly has achieved master education. And if we truly want to prepare our future providers, we need to improve those of us that are the educators, and we need to have the knowledge, skill, and the abilities to really motivate, enhance, and get our students out there. And there's certainly people that have that, but we need to go from the minority into the majority, that it's, not the exception, it's just the way things all are. But I want to end by just saying that Henry Wang had on his Facebook page the other day, he said he had a quote from Albert Einstein: "If we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research."
Yeah. That's a good one.
Yep, and I think that's very much what we have to do, is we need to continue to figure out what is best practice, not the only practice, what is the best practice for the time that we're doing right now.
I love it, and Bill, Einstein was brilliant in so many different ways. He also said the problems we have today cannot be solved at the same level thinking as the time that where they were created. We must find new ways of thinking about these things in order to solve them. So kudos to you for bringing him in the picture, and thank Henry Wang for that as well. So yes, I totally agree.
Great, and thanks to all of you out there who have contributed, and Chris O'Connor may just be generating the subject for a future podcast, which is about the academic requirements for educators. Is there a minimum level? What a great topic. I think I'm going to leave it with that. Maybe we won't be able to have a selection yet for next month, but join us for the Education Research Podcast, Friday, April 8th, 2019. We'll be sending that out soon enough. And then don't forget, we also have our clinical podcast. Oh, you know what? I have that switched. Friday, April 8th is the clinical podcast, and the education research podcast is April 26th. So you can swap those topics. April 26th is a Friday, and April 8th is a Monday. And so we'll be back with our clinical on April 8th and our education research podcast on April 26th. Thank you all for joining us. If you'd like to present an upcoming article, you can email David Page at dpage@emsed.net. Have a good one.